And good evening, Santa Cruz County and the World Wide Web beyond. My name is Sandino Gomez, and you are watching Voices from the Village, community television's longest-running public affairs show. Tonight's topic, democracy on the edge. What does it mean for our nation's both electoral system as well as its system of government, and kind of how we actually end up being governed, right? The theory is it's all about the consent of the governed, but I would argue and wager that many a person in this country both doesn't feel represented and doesn't feel super happy with the way things are going. And that's across the political spectrum, certainly from the left to the right and anything in between, or to the side of those for that matter. Tonight, we're going to be talking with three wonderful community activists that all have their hands involved in a lot of different political pots, if you will, and kind of different, we'll hear a little bit about the kind of solutions they're proposing, some of the things that they're concerned about, and some of the people that they think are actually going to be able to help fix our democracy or pull it back from the edge, if you will. I guess starting to my right, we have David Jordan. He's a community activist and by the looks of it, a supporter of Bernie Sanders.
I guess the button is a dead giveaway, Sandino.
You ratted yourself out. Welcome, David. Tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got involved with the Bernie game.
You know, he's inspired me, Sandino, as he has with so many other people, with his message about democracy on the edge, how we have people who are tuned out and cynical because they don't believe that politicians have integrity. They hear about people claiming to represent the interest of the public, and then when they get elected into office, something completely different. They've seen their voting rights stripped away. They've seen the Electoral College steal one election. And so in the midst of all this, what's inspired me, Sandino, is the way that Bernie's core messages really resonate around all that and have moved, touched, and inspired a whole group of people in our community.
Hear, hear. Thank you, David. We'll hear a little bit more about that topic and more. But to David's right, we have Rachel Goodman, a journalist and a journalism instructor at the wonderful Cabrillo College, my alma mater over there, certainly. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. So you've been a quote-unquote political person for quite a while, both on the inside and outside, as a journalist and as a staffer for William Monning.
Yes, I was honored to work for him for 3 years as his district director and press secretary, so I've seen a little bit of the inside of state politics anyway, and was lucky enough to work with someone, for someone who had a great deal of integrity. Unlike, some of the people we see getting indicted on the federal level. So we've been greatly lucky to have some wonderful representatives locally, but I would say they're a bit frustrated, as Sam Farr said when he retired, that it's just not the same place it was in Washington. And we do have someone running for that seat now who's declared as running, a couple of people actually, and I wish them the best of success because it is difficult. One of the big threats to our democracy is the gridlock that's happening in our nation's capital.
Partisanship, just preventing anything from happening regardless of what it is.
Yeah, culture of no, and that's amidst some really big challenges that I think David alluded to that Bernie Sanders is taking on, among other things, the oligarchy, the sense that the corporations are running our country and not the government. It's a government bought and paid for by the large, elite, powerful.
Best democracy money can buy.
Unfortunately, yes. So we need to push back against that, and I hope we'll talk about that more today.
Certainly. Yeah, no, I liked what you were saying before the show, and we will. I would love to hear more about that. So we're going to dive into those issues as well. As soon as we introduce to your right, Mr. Paul Elerick, excuse me, I wrote that down wrong. A self-described lifetime Democrat, and you've been involved in politics yourself for quite a while.
That's true.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Let's see, I was a member of the Democratic Central Committee for 5 years as a member, and I was the chair of that committee, the Democratic Central Committee, for another 5 years.
And what does the Democratic Central Committee do, just for our viewers who might not know?
Well, they think they do a lot of important endorsements, and they probably do. They probably do. But there's
Great honesty, I like that.
Yeah, they fight like hell to get their favorite candidates endorsed. To get on the Central Committee, I don't want to be a commercial for a Central Committee, but you ask, they're elective offices, and if you're interested, call Gail Pellerin at the county, and she'll tell you how to get your name on the ballot. But I've got, I've always been interested in progressive liberal causes, especially what is promoted in Santa Cruz by what usually was the Democrats. Now, this election to me is the most important election for president that I've ever seen. My first presidential election, I voted for John Kennedy. I turned 21 that year. So, and I thought that was a big deal, and it was a big deal. This is a bigger deal. This is a bigger deal. We're up against, the Supreme Court's at stake, all the things that progressive Democrats are for as a stake. If Hillary or Bernie, either one, they're both good candidates. If we don't get one of those people in there, we're screwed.
Yeah.
For maybe 8 years, who knows? So that's why I'm involved.
Barring the Republicans shooting themselves in the foot, which they seem to be pretty good at, yet, I don't know, they must be wearing steel-toe boots or something, because it just doesn't stick.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Paul, Rachel, and David, for joining the Voices from the Village show. Let's just start off with a question, why do you feel that democracy is on the edge, and what can people do about that? In any order, anyone jump in there and just finish each other's sentences if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm going to say I've noticed this huge change and shift in the last 30 or 40 years. When I was growing up, people would talk about politics at the dinner table. People in the family, friends, within the community, and people of differing opinions would exchange ideas in a respectful way. And these conversations were just part of our civil fabric. And it seems that we've gotten very much in the direction of disengagement, of people feeling cynical, like they can't talk to someone else for fear that they might express a different opinion, point of view, or they might offend somebody. And it's gotten to the point where you hear about people being defriended on Facebook by people whom they've maybe even intimate family members. And I wonder, what did our forefathers fight and die for to protect this country from? Our freedom. If we can't, if we're afraid, if we feel too intimidated to engage with other citizens around conversations about politics. The second thing is that people feel that the representatives in the system is rigged, but they don't necessarily understand how it's rigged. And so they're fearful. And so we're seeing that fear exploited by demagogues in the Republican Party. And I share very much your concern about this election being the most important election of our lifetime. If we do hand the presidency to a Republican, keep in mind with the Republican Congress, a Republican Supreme Court, what is that future going to look like? So the people, the millennials, who are now facing an entirely different kind of future for themselves. Maybe they've got a lot of student debt. They're out there in the job market. They're finding it difficult or impossible to find a decent job, make a living wage, survive in a place like Santa Cruz. And so we hear about democracy. What does it mean for them? How do they have their voices heard? People living on the edge, they're one medical emergency away from bankruptcy. Perhaps making decisions about, should I have kids or should I work, but I can't do both, because if I have kids, I can't afford daycare for those kids. And so these things are why democracy is on the edge. And I think that when we discuss these issues, regardless of where we stand with different points of view and opinions, we'll build our community. We'll make our community a better place.
There are various threats to our democracy that have been building for the past 30 years, and you mentioned 30 years. That was my memory when Reagan got elected and fired all the air traffic controllers for unionizing. That sent a signal that times were changing, and that was the same era in which broadcasting got deregulated and ownership of just about everything became more consolidated. So I think we had a convergence over the past 30 years of defunding public education and the public commons in general, and the funding and siphoning off of the wealth of our society upwards to the top 1%. There was news today that right-wing zealot Sheldon Adelson, who is another one of the billionaire class, just bought a Nevada newspaper, the Las Vegas Review-Journal. This ahead of a very crucial vote in Nevada that may determine the outcome of the presidential election. And the timing of that just speaks so much to the rigged part of this economy, where the power over the media goes to the corporations, the power over everyday decisions like whether to send your kid to college. It circles right back to the defunding of education and the for-profit loans that are being given to students. So
student debt surpassing, credit card and consumer debt, first time in this nation in the past 10 years.
It's a huge bubble that could very well burst and take our economy down. And when you go back to, the regulation of the banks that tried to happen with Glass-Steagall and then got repealed, did we learn nothing from 2008 when our economy was taken down by the giant banks? And when we bailed them out, there was supposed to be a reform coming. Well, they fought that, shamefully fought it, the very entities that took our economy down. So we're in a very interesting moment, as you say, where it's going to make or break our country and our democracy. Unless we take it back, it will be further and further from our reach. And what happens when people feel powerless is either they rise up in a big populist uprising and vote them out.
All right, torches and pitchforks.
Or worse, they start fighting each other. And that's what I worry about, that we will get so frustrated. And we don't want to see that.
Yeah, those that make a nonviolent revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable, right? Speaking of our boy Kennedy over there.
Two things that I've seen in the last, I don't know how many years, several years, that give credit to what we're talking about here is that people don't vote. I mean, the people that should be voting, that could have an influence on what's going on, have given it up because, why? I'm not going to take the time to vote. It doesn't do any good, and that's a real problem. The other thing, I lived in Santa Cruz, or Aptos, for 40-some years, and, it's sort of, the other thing that's come up in the last few years is the people that are without a home. Now, when I moved to Aptos in 1970, when family moved over here, there were no homeless people. There were no homeless people, I swear to God. And I don't know where, it was just one at a time. People lost their homes. And it's just, that's a critical issue right now. And I just can't imagine what would happen with the president like Donald Trump controlling the purse strings, for social issues. He wouldn't do it. There'd be more people out on the street.
Well, he said himself, the minimum wage is too high, quite the opposite of the fight for 15 and the kind of push to create either at least a minimum wage or much better even a living wage. Trump, quite the opposite, has said, our wages are too high. That's why we're getting slaughtered in the global marketplace. And, completely leaving out the very important part of this picture, looking into kind of, as I think Rachel mentioned, the deindustrialization, the kind of way that trade and trade deals have led to the devastation of the American economy and the destruction of the middle class. That was a headline I just read recently, was for the first time ever, the quote-unquote middle class is less than half of the country's population. And where is that going? That wealth is really, the wealth is going up, but the people are more going into the lower classes.
And people get that our tax system is set up to favor that redistribution of wealth. They get it that it's a rigged system. They may not, as you pointed out with the failings of our educational system over the last 30 years and our de-investment there. And they've also seen the increasing privatization of everything now, including our infrastructure. Water companies now are being purchased by foreign companies. And so we finally have a generation with the millennials that face a future of student debt, can't find a job, living a life with prospects less than what my parents had. And it's through the lens of this that, as you've said, they become cynical, they become disengaged. So then what? Our challenge is this. Our challenge is to get them to understand that the only way they can change this, the only way they can create the possibility of a better life for themselves is by being active in the process. We only have two rights. The right to vote doesn't always get counted, and consumer choice. And these are very powerful rights that we have. The ability to execute those rights consciously is what we need to have conversations with people about.
I think you mentioned a couple really interesting issues around that. You mentioned the trade pact, the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership that's being negotiated. The text just came out a month ago, and nobody had seen it. It's very secretive.
Only WikiLeaks had gotten very few chapters secretly released from some sympathetic source inside.
Right,
But
so
other than that,
November, the text comes out, and it turns out it's more devastating than a lot of the critics thought, that
Even
it's going
worse.
to cause a real dive in jobs in this country and will weaken environmental protections. And most of these international trade agreements and things that are undermining the middle class, as you mentioned, they're not being negotiated for the benefit of the people. Nobody asked for them.
Right.
They're being negotiated for the benefit of the big transnational corporations that, I have a handy-dandy chart here that shows that in
Bring it on.
1966 is when the corporate taxes started to drop in relation to individual income tax and payroll tax. So we're taxing work, the everyday person's work, but we're not taxing the ability to make mega profits and siphon them off to people living in luxury in various countries and on islands and various second or third homes. And these are very anti-democratic impulses to siphon off wealth and to de-invest in education. So I think any of the candidates we're supporting here, and you haven't mentioned who you're supporting, and the reason I'm supporting Bernie Sanders is because I think he's the one person who's not taking corporate money to the extent that the other candidates are. And that to me is a very big, exciting plus for him. Everyone else inevitably is going to be beholden. It's impossible not to, given the way Citizens United is
it's a
rigging the
pay-to-play
system.
system.
It is, and even if you don't want to pay to play and you wish you were above it, if you're a candidate and you take that money, that dark money, and you might not even know from whom you're getting it.
Right.
They're just running ads for you. Then they call you later and said, by the way, did you like that ad? And now it's time to pay up. So that worries me greatly.
That's
And
go ahead.
it's a fairly new thing, and it was only since 2010 that the huge dark money super PACs began to rear their ugly, ugly heads, and it's been growing ever since. I think I have some statistics I'll share with you later about how bad, but it's, this is worse than it was even during 2012. It looks like it's going to be. So, and we don't know who the Koch brothers are funding so far. I bet they're betting on all of them,
Well, it's very interesting. You kind of bring up the role of the mega money, and I mean, you have, you mentioned Sheldon Anderson and him buying this newspaper, but it should also be noted that the Republican debate was held in his casino. I mean, talk about literally holding your political process within the temple of the money that, quote unquote, greases the wheel, makes it all possible. I mean, it's really. It's a shame, I think, and what you said about, any candidate really, for the most part, very, very rarely do you find, the Ralph Nader or the Bernie Sanders who says, I'm not going to take corporate money. But, it's just a shame. Both parties in our country, and quite frankly, I think we need more than two parties, but both parties are simply going after the same trough of money and ultimately really having to answer for those donations. And you look at things like the trade pacts and kind of, you put in, I'm trying to think of a good example, but you put in like a little bit of money in getting a certain person elected, and that might really pay off in some legislation or some trade deal later on. I mean, it's like literally, corporations invest in both sides of the political process. They're, donating to Democrats, they're donating to Republicans.
And increasingly, they're writing legislation. A lot of people don't realize that
Right.
part of the equation, that some of it is lifted verbatim from talking points from some of these corporate moguls.
And that's part of that
Or
evolution.
organization.
30 years ago, one of these lobbyists would walk into the legislator's office and they would maybe offer some ideas, and maybe some of those ideas or suggestion would make it in legislation. That's now since evolved into
Things
the
like ballot.
lobbyists literally writing the legislation, taking it over to the legislator's office, and those legislators presenting that almost verbatim as a bill in front of the legislature. And that level of corruption is something that has evolved, unfortunately, for the worse over that 30-year period. So, but again, I think if we just talk about the corruption of money in politics, it's not going to be as likely to engage people who are tuned out as relating to their specific concerns. Be it healthcare, be it education, be it these social issues, be it the core economics of the top 1% controlling 99% of the wealth in this country. 14 people made more money last year than 40% of the bottom of the American. This is a moral issue.
Right.
And when we start to see it in those terms, then we reframe the debate.
Yeah, I just want to
Go ahead.
clear the air. I am an unabashedly proud to be a Hillary supporter. I'm a Hillary supporter. Bernie's a great candidate. I'm looking at, I think, nationwide, that I would think Hillary's got I think she's got the edge. I may be surprised. And that's great. That just shows you what grassroots politicking can do. But it's just so important.
You'd be surprised if she didn't get it, you're saying?
No, I'd be surprised. I'd be surprised if Bernie got the nomination.
The nomination.
And I'd be surprised if he got elected.
Well, interestingly, Bernie's support has set records in terms of the number of donations, and his donations, over 80% of them are under $200.
I know, that's
Hillary's
I
are
believe
it's an 80-20 flop the other direction for her. But the thing is that in his last re-election, he got over 70% of the vote. Now, I'm sure that 70% of the voters in Vermont, albeit a small state, are not Democrats. So Bernie was very successful in appealing to a wide range of voters. We're talking about independents and, even some Republicans. And so his message appeals to the millennials. It appeals to women. It appeals to people who are middle class, teachers, police officers. It appeals to veterans. And so he has that wide range of appeal that I think is going to be central to his success in the long run. The other thing is that Bernie's negatives are very low. He doesn't get involved in scandals. He's never run a negative campaign. And so we unfortunately risk losing the presidency to the Republicans if we should nominate Hillary Clinton. There are two active investigations going on right now. One is from the Department of Justice. This isn't a sham Benghazi Republican, trying to political
Mudslinging
game,
kind of
mudslinging kind of thing. This is, the FBI looking into the Clinton Foundation, and this is the Department of Justice looking into her activities as Secretary of State. If either of these investigations results in an indictment after the nomination but before the election, what do you think the Democrats' chances of winning the White House are?
I don't know. I just think they'd be better. Nationwide, middle America would vote more for, Democrats would vote more for Hillary than they would for Bernie.
There was an interesting Quinnipiac poll that showed Bernie Sanders with sort of something like a 12-point lead over Trump. Now, again, what's interesting about these discussions is on both sides, people can't quite believe that these candidates are having the traction they have. And I think there's members of the Democratic Party who equally cannot quite believe. And I'm not saying that Bernie Sanders nationwide has the traction that Trump is getting, but remember, Trump only has an edge over 8 or 10 other people. So he even at his top numbers, he's at 39%.
Right.
So we have to relatively look at where these Hillary also beats Trump in the latest poll as well, but by a smaller margin. So I think maybe what you're talking about is the risk factor of which candidate you feel has a better chance.
Also, in addition to that, though, you're right. But in addition to that, I'm talking about the negatives. So there's a large group of people that already have established an opinion that, Hillary, for example, we were talking about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement. So in the first debate, she had noted that she had supported it if it were the gold standard. And she's well known as having been supportive of that behind the scenes. Once it was apparent that it wasn't going to go through, and it became politically expedient to shift her point of view on that, she said, but the final draft wasn't the gold standard, so I couldn't support it. I mean, that was such a sleight of hand that even somebody who doesn't know all the details of the TPP would say, wait a second, you're trying to fool me here. And I think it's that integrity thing that really has created a lot of traction for Bernie. It's created, the idea that here's somebody who could get to politics in 30 years of public service, saying what he thinks and doing what he says and having a consistent track record.
I think a lot of what all of you are speaking to is really sort of politics as usual and or the status quo or just what is acceptable or kind of standard political logic. And then you have someone like Trump who just speaks his mind, isn't spending any money on political consultants, and that genuineness, regardless of the idiotic things he's saying, it speaks to people because it isn't politics as usual. It isn't Jeb Bush up there, triangulating or and I think it's a very similar phenomenon with Bernie, where he's really just saying things that are just outrageous. And I loved the moment in the most recent Democratic debate when the moderator asked, should corporate America like Hillary Clinton? Everyone should like Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders, is corporate America going to like President Sanders? No, they're not. I mean, that is not typical. And
boy, you hit the nail on the head. How ironic is that? That you would think that Trump and Bernie Sanders are completely on the opposite ends of the spectrum, and yet I have found that to be true. What you said about it's a similar phenomenon.
Speaking about phenomena, I watch, every once in a while I'll make a mistake and watch CNN. They had a great program on last night about the 60s, and they featured the 1960 presidential Republican convention with Barry Goldwater's speech, and the crowds were going crazy. He'd say all this stuff about, well, if you remember him, the conservatism in whatever, I can't remember. Anyway, brought down the House. And it's just like it's repeating itself right now. When Trump gets up there and says something really stupid, and it was a little less flagrant, but here's a whole hall full of people. I don't even know where it was, Miami or someplace. Anyway, there's packed, just standing up and cheering Barry Goldwater, who got walloped in the election.
Yeah, I mean, a strong. It's one thing when you're just talking to a room full of your supporters. It's another thing when you're actually facing the electorate and the American people and really identifying with their problems. I mean, I think a lot of politicians, quite frankly, are out of touch with the American working class. They're not concerned about the American working class. They're shipping those jobs overseas so that there can be bigger corporate profits here. I mean, it's really frustrating. And I think, again, it's a very similar phenomenon with both these two politicians, where they're just speaking to those folks, those disaffected folks. The largest voting bloc in this country is actually the non-voters. And I think talking to a lot of my peers, and I don't agree with them, but I understand their frustration. Give me something worth voting for, and I'll vote. But I look at the previous candidates in the 20-some odd years almost 20 years I've been able to participate in the political process, and it's very rare that I find someone I'm excited about. And I'll admit it, I voted for Nader in 2000. I don't think he's the reason why Gore lost the election. Gore lost the election on his own. If he just carried his own home state, Florida would have been irrelevant, but he didn't. So, it's a problem because people get all jazzed about these candidates, or there is the occasional one that inspires, But the standard narrative is they can't win, they won't win, there's no chance, nothing's going to happen. Just be realistic here. And I think that's what turned me off to politics, and certainly what turns a lot of my peers, and I think the millennials that you keep referring to, they're actually smarter than you think. You know, they're very strong on issues, but it's time and time again, it's the candidates that fail them, and the politics as usual that fail them, and they don't want to get involved in that.
Well, people were saying Obama could never win. He had a funny middle name. He was an African American by all accounts.
Wasn't a citizen either.
And, well,
They're still saying that.
they're
in
still
fact.
saying he wasn't a citizen. Of course he is a citizen.
Yeah.
But people said at this same point in the election, there's no way Obama could have won. And when we're talking about presidential politics, you have to remember there was a lot of hope, serious hope, when he got elected that things were really going to change now.
Yeah.
Even though a lot of us knew he was a pretty centrist guy at heart and not a radical at all, or a leftist, as much as his opponents would like to paint him that way. But what has happened is the Congress went the other way and just blocked him at every single move and would do almost anything, including voting against a constituent's needs, like they did with health care. There are governors, Republican governors, denying their own people free health care that's available to them through the federal government.
Just because it's Obama's
despite
program.
Obama.
Yeah.
So they're hurting poor people just to get at Obama. And that dynamic probably is not going to change unless we sweep Congress again with more moderate liberal candidates, because
Or even real true conservatives instead of corporate conservatives.
You know, they've been sold on a bill of goods that if they go for Obamacare, that a few years down the road, the cost of it will be shifted from the federal to the state and they'll get swamped. So the thing is that, you know, there's a fear mongering going in there. And
Fear is a huge part of our politics.
it's a huge part of it. And again, we talk about going back to democracy on the edge. When people are afraid, they tend to gravitate more toward people who play on those fears. And, you know, Donald Trump being a good example of that. Now, Bernie Sanders is on the other side of that in terms of he is appealing to people's sensibility for shared common values and fairness, not just a system that works for a very small minority. If you go to a website called isidewith.com, it'll go through and ask you a series of questions about your values, your priorities, what kind of policies and things like that you support. And then it will match those with the positions and voting records of the various candidates. And it'll do a percentage match for you. It'll aggregate that information by state and so forth. And you know what you find is that, you know, here's a way to get through the media messaging and labels like socialist and things that people have immediate, often adverse reactions to, and just identify with the candidates that most closely align with what you think. And again, this is a way for people to connect with their particular wants, needs, and priorities to the political process.
Go ahead.
One good thing, I mean, a lot of good things about Bernie. I can't list them all. The most important thing that comes to mind right now is it's going to get people out to vote.
Yeah.
There are so many important things on California ballot, on your ballot, that will get people out to vote that would normally not vote. And there's going to be some very important state ballot measures. I don't know whether they're all, you know, settled upon yet, but if we have another, you know, 28% voter turnout, we're going to get screwed there
What do you
too.
think the most important one is on the?
I'd have to see them in a list, but the one that comes to mind is the people that want to change. They want to change the plastic bag law. The plastic bag people have got a hold of people that will, you know, go out and get their signatures for money. It's going to be on a ballot. It's
So this is a symptom, just real quickly before we move on, what you said really resonates with, you know, people tuning out again, because, you know, anybody who knows anything about plastics in our environment knows that it's a good idea to ban these single-use plastics things, but somebody with a small, a narrow interest like the plastics bag manufacturing industry can sink millions of dollars into a campaign where they get enough signatures to place their, proposition on the ballot and fool just enough people with tricky language, and who has the time to read through and sort
You
through
put a
all
nice,
these
like,
things?
friendly title
But yeah,
on
this
it, like
is
the Plastic Ban for America bill.
But this is a poster child for what we're talking about,
yeah.
right?
I guess that's the only one that came into my mind, but there's a bunch of others too.
Well, it's a shame because like the initiative process was actually designed to be a
Yes.
countermeasure to
Right.
the influence of money in politics and to counter the corruption
Right.
in the halls and the legislatures.
How ironic.
How ironic now that it's absolutely become another tool for moneyed interests and corporate power to kind of enact their agenda.
There's a group called California Forward that's been trying to reform some of those initiative processes so you can't have paid signature gatherers, just
That's the other one.
flooding the whole.
I always ask every time one of those cats asks me, and I've done it. I'm not. I'm guilty. I have collected signatures for money. It's kind of a shameful thing, but hey, we got to survive. And yeah, it's frustrating because I remember I was collecting for the recall. I wasn't a Davis fan, and I wasn't a Schwarzenegger fan, but the Davis people were paying $1 a signature not to sign the thing, and the Schwarzenegger people were paying $2 a signature.
And you're working for both.
I was playing both sides. I'll be real. I was
dual
broke.
agent, Sandino.
I had no integrity. I was a starving student. But the reality is, people make economic decisions. They're not
Sure.
going to make political decisions. And
That's
when
right.
it comes down to it, hey, if I've got to pay an extra $1 for that bag or get a free plastic bag, I mean, we don't think logically when it comes to economics. And I think that's one of the most amazing phenomenons of American politics over the past 30 years is convincing the working class to consistently vote against their interests, primarily by voting Republicans. But let's be real. I mean, Clinton passed NAFTA, Clinton passed the crime bill, Clinton passed a lot of things that kind of really screwed up. So there's blame to go around on both sides.
Yep, plenty.
Boy, you hit the
And
nail on
it's
the head.
just a
And when
shame.
people get that, now they're having to make a decision between making their health care premium payment or making their car payment because somebody lost a job or they had, a medical emergency, this is exactly what you're talking about.
Well, I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to let you know, as this person obviously knows, that this is a live call-in show. If you're watching December 29th, 2015, you can call in. Oh, look, here's the number right there. And you can insert your voice to our discussion right here. So, just like this person right here. Hello, caller. You're on the air, Voices from the Village. What's your name?
Hi, my name is Kat.
Hey, Kat, thank you for calling. Did you have a question or a comment for any of our panelists?
Yes, I do. I'm really enjoying this. Thank you so much for doing it. It's great because the media, we're all talking about what the media does, so this is wonderful.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm really, really, really tired of business as usual, and that's what got us into all these messes that we're in. And business as usual meaning big money wins out. And I know that that the top that Hillary's supporters are like all big money, and she's business as usual, and Bernie's are no big money. And I also want to say that businesses, and she voted for the Iraq War, and Bernie said that it wouldn't be a good idea because we'd make all kinds of enemies over there and destabilize the government, and that's what we have now with Saddam Hussein's Guard and a lot of other Sunnis being replaced with Shias, and it's a huge mess, and they're very angry. And that's what we have now, more terrorism. And also one more thing real quick is that...
Please, go ahead.
Pardon me?
Please, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Lost my train of thought. Okay. It's just more business. Oh, and that when we let the CIA or our corporations, et cetera, let the CIA go into different countries and get rid of democratically elected leaders that they don't like because, say, Mossadegh in Iran is wanting to nationalize the oil there, and so BP gets mad and sends in hitmen or whatever, getting people out that are democratically elected leaders, Allende, et cetera. There are lots of examples. That's business as usual, and Hillary Clinton is steeped in that as Secretary of State, and that's all I want to say, and thank you so much.
Hey, no problem. Thank you very much for calling in.
You're welcome. Bye.
And you can call in also 425-8848, extension 30. Please, if you're watching on December 29th, 2015, feel free to call in and add your voice, just like Kat just did. That's a good point, and I actually be named after our Sandinista friends. You know, I've studied Latin American politics pretty extensively, and something that just constantly frustrates me that our caller just brought up is sort of the U.S. meddling in other countries' politics. And I got to call Hillary Clinton out here as Secretary of State. She really legitimized the coup in Honduras and kind of, unfortunately, provided a Democratic backing, you know, and when that election occurred, she was like, oh, well, democracy has returned, it's all good. Whereas, like, we're talking about an election where it's kind of like this, you know, like gun your head situation.
Honduras, and it's now a failed drug state, and it wasn't, and before, you know, it was a democratic thriving. So, you know, a lot of people have said, well, we support Hillary because of her foreign policy experience, and I say, really, do you know what's happened in Honduras?
Yeah.
You know, or she'll talk about Libya. And I'll say, well, gee, how are things going in Libya right now? Right. And in general, one of the defining issues is when it comes to these foreign policy things, whether it be Central America or the Middle East, is where were we when the chips were down and we had to make a tough decision? Well, we do have two very good data points when the Iraq War came up in 2003. As you know, it was very popular to support the war. Hillary Clinton supported it. And Bernie Sanders not only did not support it, but he said, if we do this, then we will stand a very big chance of creating a power vacuum and instability and a recruiting tool for future terrorists. And that's exactly what happened. Yeah. A lot of people don't know that the head of ISIS was actually in Abu Ghraib when the Americans ran it. So Bernie's words were very prescient. So we want a strong leader who is knowledgeable enough and courageous enough to take a tough stand and do the right thing when the chips are down. And you know, the $4 trillion that we've invested in that Iraq war that it's cost the U.S. taxpayer, you know, the question I ask is, do we feel that we're safer?
Well, let's talk about that, because the way the media jumped on the recent events, sad, horrible events in Paris, was to crank up the fear machine one more time. It's just a new opponent, ISIS.
Or in San Bernardino.
Yeah, and to link those two, where those people were not recruited, unless you count looking at the internet as recruitment, they recruited themselves out of their own mental state or disaffectation, but they weren't a coordinated part of ISIL or ISIS. And the way it was being reported was that they linked Paris and San Bernardino very quickly in the media. And lo and behold, in the polls, the first issue that rose to the top of the American agenda was terrorism. You have a higher chance of being killed by a terrorist, by a rattlesnake, than you do right now of a terrorist. And it's not to downgrade the danger it poses in a general sense geopolitically to draw us into a war. That's probably the bigger danger. But it does cause the agenda to shift. And in my media class, I talk a lot about agenda setting. And CNN and MSNBC are agenda setters because they have 24 hours to fill, and fear sells commercials. I hate to be so crass about the connection there. No, it also sells candidates.
Legitimate, yeah.
And that's why that was the shifted focus of the last debate. And I felt very sad that that dominated so much. They never mentioned global warming once, and that's got a high potential to destabilize geopolitical events very quickly should the effects start to ramp up, which they inevitably will. So either candidate would be on the Democratic side, at least recognizes it's real and wants to deal with it,
well, with
whereas the other side just
yeah.
doesn't believe it's happening.
Right. That's
much more scary to me, and that CNN refused to ask about it. Instead, they asked about the First Lady. And what a wasted question that was.
Well, you know, democracy is on the edge because people are in fear mode. I mean, this is why people are disengaged, and that's why we're having this conversation here. But I mean, to the point of, you know, we have now disassociated ourselves from the cause and effect. So, you know, the whole San Bernardino thing, as you were pointing out, Rachel, people now ascribe that to, Syrians. And so the response is keep Syrians from coming into the country, which has no connection with that at all. Again, because they are in fear mode. And the reason we don't talk about the most important existential issue for all of us, which is climate change, is because we are in fear mode. And so it keeps us in that fight or flight kind of stage of reaction to things, and it keeps us from analyzing, looking at what's really going on at a deeper level.
What really upset me about the Paris attacks, and it's a horrible thing, but that it was used to justify, quite frankly, an anti-democratic policy of not allowing protests or demonstrations during the COP21 climate change talks. I mean, here we are, supposedly the democratic nations of the world getting together to talk about the pivotal issue of our future and our children's future and whatnot. Oh, but we can't have a demonstration outside. You can have soccer games and the shopping malls are open, but please, no more political demonstrations. And I was really impressed by the way that people came up with creative ways to do that, whether it was the giant red line, the literal red line that they all held. I don't know if you folks heard about the shoes demonstrations. They filled up all these plazas and public places with just empty pairs of shoes instead of, you can't have the people there, but hey, I would have been there. There are my shoes to prove it. And I couldn't agree more that the fear is used to set an agenda. Unfortunately, it's whose agenda and what agenda. More people have been killed by white supremacist and right-wing militia-type anti-government violence that are, quite frankly, acts of terrorism than have been killed by Muslim fundamentalist terrorism since 9/11. But we're not talking about what kind of terrorism, or is that terrorism, right? That's described as a lone wolf, extremist, lone gunman kind of. They use these terms to talk about certain people, and then there's these other terms used to talk about other types of people. And it's quite frustrating, quite frankly. And I think it shows like this, and like public media, and like community media, where people have an actual chance to speak out, that is the antidote to that kind of, that type of journalism.
And we need to keep our media more accessible. For that reason, I'm very grateful to community television, and I'm very sad that we have lost other outlets in our community to talk to each other that have become kind of pop wallpaper instead of discussion zones. And I'm very grateful that you continue to have Voices of the Village, because then we can talk about important issues like this.
Yeah. Shout out Charlie.
I just wrote off MSNBC a long time ago. I mean, I used to watch it, but when I turned it on by mistake the other day, they were showing Donald Trump's life story when he was in high school, and what a handsome guy he was, and how he got $1 million from his dad to start his fortune, and all the honeys that he
What
had.
a self-made man,
Yeah.
It's so nice.
So now
that
it's becoming like ABC, because they had 81 mentions of Donald Trump for every one mention of Bernie Sanders. And this is one way that the status quo deals with people like Bernie Sanders, who are a existential challenge to their interest, okay? They ignore them. They marginalize them. And so the biggest thing that I've heard, quite frankly, as a con for people who are fairly politically aware, is that they don't think Bernie Sanders is electable. But he is electable. And but there's this perception that's created, again, it's perpetuated by the mass media, that he just is not electable. And that's what they're counting on to keep the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, that's a narrative that's created in the myth.
They're all in
media,
on
and they
it.
perpetuate
They're
it.
all in on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean-
they're owned by the same corporations who have a very big interest in getting these people back elected and keeping the status quo, because it's rigged in their favor and continues to be the narrative that everything's fine as long as we leave the banks alone to make lots of money and it will trickle down. That kind of mythology has perpetuated itself, even though economists, right and left, have said that's just not the way economics works. After 30 years, it hasn't worked.
Right.
But the mythology that it does is
Persists.
just rediscussed.
You brought up a really important point that I think really speaks to the kind of myth that Bernie's unelectable or whatnot. Well, number one, he's been elected how many times back to Congress? And granted, that's the state of Vermont. That's not the entire nation. But he has made this incredible gang. He set a record in the number of donations, in the types of donations. He set all these different records. And it is just, as David said, despite the Bernie blackout, right? Trump receiving ridiculous amount of coverage. I mean, he blows his nose and the media's all over it. Bernie has been able to make all this progress and to get to these polling numbers despite the fact that the media really doesn't mention him. I mean, he's had his pathetic debate, well, I shouldn't say pathetic debate performances. He's had this pathetic debate schedule where they put them on Saturdays and they put them on times when no one's watching. And despite that, he's still able to make these advances in the polls. I mean, it's just, I'll come out and say it. I'm a Bernie fan, I'm a Bernie supporter, and it's just so frustrating when I run into that, oh, politics as usual, typical narrative, he can't be elected, da 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 da. And I think there's a real, it's a shame, because if the Democrats just want to centralize and triangulate and play the middle position, well, then most folks would rather just have the real thing, you know? If you're going to play to the right, well, why not just really elect someone to the right? You know, it's like, do I want a Budweiser or do I want a Bud Light? Well, I'll have a Budweiser, you know? I don't want the Democratic light. I don't know, it's just my opinion there, but it's really frustrating that it doesn't seem like the progressive causes or the, you know, liberal, radical economic causes have a party or a champion. It's very rare and few and far between that you get someone like that, you know?
Once in a lifetime.
There's the
We've been
Kucinich,
around
there's the
for a
Barbara
while.
Lee, but
But they didn't
And-
get this many votes as
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders is. And I'm curious, Paul, what you think about this. What's going to happen at the convention if Bernie gets as far as he may get by then? And the other side is probably having the same conversation.
I mean, what if he wins?
What if he wins in Iowa and New Hampshire and Nevada?
I wish him the best.
Will there be a brokered convention?
No.
They're talking about it in the Republican
Republicans.
side.
That's a Republican
Yeah.
trick.
They won't let Trump get in.
They won't let him get in.
But they do have,
Bring back
the
Mitt, right? That was
Democrats
the
do have the
latest sneaky one.
superdelegates, and I believe that they comprise about 10% of the total delegate count. And it's also my understanding that, you know, because of party connections and endorsements and things of this nature, that probably Hillary has, you know, the lion's share of that locked up. So it's not a complete democratic process in the sense that every delegate is represented in the same way. But it is the process we have. And you know what, Sandino, to your point earlier when you had disclosed you had voted for Nader, if consider this, Bernie had decided to run as an independent instead of as part of the Democratic Party, we'd be having a whole different conversation.
yeah.
We would,
Yeah.
indeed.
You know, politics real is there are two parties.
Right.
And if you're not one of those at the moment,
Right now,
you know, you're going to pull a Ross Perot and cost Bush the election.
Yep.
I paid attention back then.
So did I. I was the chairman of the Democratic Party here in Santa Cruz County. We were we had a headquarters in the Vets Hall, and we had a TV there, and they announced that Gore won. And I got some
He
pictures.
did, he won the popular vote, that was correct.
Yeah. And I got a picture of all the workers holding up the signs. And then somebody said, "There's another report coming in."
It was Fox News, right?
And
They're
it was
the ones that
Bush's
called it the other
cousin.
way.
It was
There's winning
George
the
W.
election,
Bush's
and then there's
cousin who
winning
worked
the
for
election.
Fox
Yeah.
that said the election's been called for George W. Bush. And he was George W.'s cousin who happened to work for
Yes,
Fox.
coincidence.
And then they spent 28 days trying to prove that wasn't the case, but it gave it a sense of inevitability. And I think this narrative about Hillary Clinton's been interesting in the media too, not to always go back to the media analysis, but the aura of inevitability that permeates her candidacy has got some traction to it and got some power to it. I don't know if
It
that
can
can
be a
continue.
self-fulfilling prophecy.
I think people do. They said, well, I just don't think he'll win, so therefore I'm not going to vote for him. And then indeed he doesn't, so.
And that's often,
Or they
more
don't.
often than not, that seems to be the way that politics works out, is no one actually ever votes for who they want. You just vote so that the other guy doesn't win it, or the other woman in this case. But I mean, it's a shame because I don't think there's a lot of people that are genuinely excited about any of the candidates. With a few exceptions, of
The
course.
real question is if it does come down to Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, would the Bernie Sanders supporters stay home? I don't think so, but I know a few who would.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine them not feeling the
Time to vote.
urgency of that
Time
vote.
to vote for Leonard Peltier again. Oh, jeez.
The write-in candidate.
Peace and Freedom Party. I've done it before. Do it again.
Absolutely.
I might have to slit my wrists.
Well, don't do that.
I'm just moving to Canada. Come on, let's be real. They got that
Okay,
hot new prime minister. He's awesome.
We haven't even
I'll take
talked
New
about
Zealand.
vice presidential possibilities
Yeah, we
yet.
missed
Ooh.
that.
That's a whole
Elizabeth
other-
Warren.
She said she won't go. A lot of people said if any of these two candidates on the
Yeah.
Democratic side got her to run.
So we're believe it or not, reaching the end of our show. I'm surprised we didn't even need our 2 campaign videos. We had such a lively conversation that there was no need to cut into those. Apologize, viewers, you had to watch us the whole time. But just kind of last thoughts, any urgent messages you want to get out there, or websites you want to send people to, or anything like that. Why don't we start with you, Paul? Just kind of wrap-up statement, if you'd like.
The wrap-up statement, I would like to ask everybody to make sure they're registered to vote.
Yeah.
There's always people that have moved that don't get around to re-registering. There's going to be people walking around with clipboards if they're not already doing it. Find them, go to the county building and register to vote. It's very important. Don't wait.
Especially in a lot of states where they made it really difficult to
Yeah,
vote.
we should take advantage of it because it's not difficult here.
Not here, yeah.
And I want to just echo what Paul said earlier, which is I don't think there has been a more important election in years and decades as this one. At what's at stake is really our democracy and how we're going to live our lives in the next 20 or 30 years.
Here. David?
And I believe that our democracy is at stake, and so all of us are called to action. We need to get the community involved and for people to see that they are stakeholders in this process. And so getting them actively involved, finding at a personal level how their participation in the political process is going to make a difference is something that we as a community, Voices of the Village, all share.
Here, here. Well, thank you so much, Paul, Rachel, and David. I really enjoyed our conversation tonight. I hope you guys had as much fun. And I hope you had as much fun as well, Santa Cruz and the World Wide Web watching online. On behalf of all of the staff and the board members, everyone who makes community television possible, I want to thank our camera and our crew, the people up in the booth working the boards. My name is Sandino Gomez, and I guess I'll just leave you with this. Our democracy is for sale, and we are on the edge. And what we choose to do with that at this moment, as our panelists said, that's really up to you. And I just echo the concern. Please, 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 at the very least, inform yourself. Vote for the lesser of the evils if you need to. As long as you get out there, inform yourself and vote, and encourage other people to do so as well. With that, don't forget, there's always torches and pitchforks. My name's Sandino Gomez. Have a good night.